The branch snapped beneath her foot, and Lyra froze, her heart slamming against her ribs, as a low growl rolled out from the shadows between the trees. She was not supposed to be here. Every wolf in the moonlit pack knew that the land beyond the old stone marker belonged to someone else, someone whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes. She had crossed that marker without thinking, chasing the pale glow of a single moonflower, and now the forest had gone completely silent around her, as if it were holding its breath along with her. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the dark line of trees, but she saw nothing. No eyes, no movement, just the wind pulling at the hem of her worn brown dress, and the smell of damp earth and pine. For a moment, she almost convinced herself she had imagined the sound. Then it came again, closer this time, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Lyra pressed the small basket of flowers tighter against her chest and took a careful step backward. Her ankle rolled on a loose stone and she stumbled, arms flailing, and landed hard on the damp leaves with a startled gasp. The basket flew from her hands, spilling pale moonflowers across the forest floor. She lay there for a heartbeat, stunned, staring up at the canopy of branches and the thin slice of moon caught between them, and thought, with the strange calm that sometimes comes right before disaster, that this was exactly the kind of thing that always happened to her. She was still lying there, trying to catch her breath, when a massive gray wolf stepped out from between two trees and looked directly at her. He was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, larger even than Edwin, the alpha of her own pack, who was already an imposing man both in human and wolf form. This wolf's fur was the color of storm clouds, silver at the tips, and his eyes were a pale, burning gold that seemed to see straight through her. He did not growl again. He did not need to. He simply stood there, utterly still, studying her the way a hunter studies something he has not yet decided whether to chase. Lyra scrambled backward on her hands and heels, too frightened to stand, too frightened to look away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she had no idea if wolves in this form could understand her, or if they cared even when they could. "I didn't mean to come this far. I was only picking flowers. Please, I'll go. I'll go right now." The wolf tilted his head slightly, as if her words amused him, and then, to her horror, he began to walk toward her, slow and deliberate, each paw placed without a sound on the leaf-covered ground. She had heard stories, of course. Every Omega in the pack had grown up hearing them, whispered around the fire on cold nights, stories about the Alpha King who ruled the territory beyond the marker, a man so powerful that 3 lesser packs had folded into his lands rather than risk his anger. They said his wolf had never chosen a mate, that he trained every morning until his knuckles split, that he had once faced down a rogue alpha twice his size without so much as raising his voice first. They said his eyes could freeze a person in place from across a room. Lyra had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, the way stories about powerful men so often were. Looking up now at the wolf closing the distance between them, she was no longer sure of anything. "Please," she said again, her voice cracking. "I have a grandmother. She's sick. I only wanted the flowers for her tea. I didn't know this was your land. I swear I didn't know." The wolf stopped only a few feet away from her. He lowered his great head until his golden eyes were level with hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Lyra could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. She could see her breath misting faintly in the cool morning air. And then, impossibly, the wolf let out a soft huffing sound that was almost like a sigh. He backed away from her, just a step, and his powerful frame began to shimmer and shift, bones cracking and reshaping themselves in a way that should have looked painful, but seemed, on him, almost effortless. Fur receded into skin, paws lengthened into hands. Within a few heartbeats, where the wolf had stood, there was now a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair falling across a face carved from sharp, unforgiving lines. He wore only a pair of loose trousers, as most shifters did when they changed back unexpectedly, and even half-dressed he carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Lyra's mouth went dry. "You're trespassing," the man said. His voice was low and even, without a trace of the anger she had braced herself for. It was almost worse that way, calm and certain, like a judgment already made. "I know," she said quickly. "I'm truly sorry. I'll leave right now, I promise. I just need to gather my—" She tried to push herself up too fast, forgetting entirely about the tangle of roots beside her, and her foot caught in them the moment she rose. She pitched forward with a startled cry, arms pinwheeling, straight toward the stranger standing in front of her. He caught her. His hands closed around her arms without hesitation, steadying her before she could fall, and the instant his skin touched hers, something happened that neither of them expected. A jolt ran through Lyra's entire body, warm and electric, starting where his fingers pressed into her arms and spreading outward until even her fingertips tingled with it. She gasped. Above her, she heard the man's breath catch as well, sharp and sudden, and when she looked up into his face, she saw his golden eyes had gone wide, with something that looked almost like shock. "What was that?" she whispered, before she could stop herself. He didn't answer right away. He was still holding her arms, though he had clearly steadied her already, and he made no move to let go. His gaze moved over her face slowly, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of it, from the flush in her cheeks to the leaves caught in her dark hair. Something in his expression shifted, the cold judgment melting into raw disbelief. "Say that again," he said quietly. "What you said before. Tell me your name." "Lyra," she managed. "My name is Lyra." He repeated it under his breath, as though testing the shape of it, and Lyra felt her stomach twist into knots she had no name for. She had never been this close to a man like him before, had never felt anything like the warmth still spreading beneath her skin, where his hands rested. It frightened her more than his growl had. "You should let go of me," she said, though she made no effort to pull away herself. "I know," he said, but he didn't. For a long moment they simply stood there, tangled together in the middle of the forest, the fallen moonflowers scattered around their feet like pale stars against the dark earth. Somewhere in the trees a bird called out, breaking the strange spell just enough for the man to finally release her arms and step back, though his eyes never left her face. "You don't know who I am," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Lyra shook her head slowly. She had a terrible suspicion forming in the back of her mind, one she desperately hoped was wrong, but the way he carried himself, the way the whole forest seemed to have gone still and respectful around him, told her it probably was not. "I think I might," she admitted. "You're him, the Alpha King." Something flickered across his face, there and gone too quickly for her to name it. "Cade," he said. "My name is Cade Ashgrove." Lyra's knees felt suddenly weak, and this time it had nothing to do with tripping over roots. She had stumbled onto the private land of the most powerful alpha in the region, been caught by his wolf, and was now standing close enough to see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, all because she had wanted to pick flowers for her grandmother's tea. "I should go," she said again, more desperately this time. "Please, I'm sorry. I'll never come back here, I swear it. I won't tell anyone I saw you, I won't." "Wait." His voice cut through her babbling, not sharp, but firm enough to still her completely. "Where do you live?" "The moonlit pack. Just beyond the old stone marker, on the other side of the river." He nodded slowly, though his eyes had gone distant, as if he were listening to something she could not hear. Lyra did not know, could not have known, that deep inside him, his wolf was howling with a joy so overwhelming it nearly brought the powerful king to his knees. The wolf had caught her scent the moment she crossed the border, had tracked her through the trees with a hunger that had nothing to do with hunting, and now, standing this close to her, every instinct in Cade's body was screaming the same impossible truth. Mate. This clumsy, frightened, flower-picking Omega girl was his mate. He had spent years dismissing the very idea. His advisors had paraded eligible she-wolves before him for a decade, daughters of allied packs, warriors with impressive lineages, and his wolf had never so much as stirred for any of them. He had begun to believe the bond simply was not meant for him, that some kings ruled alone. And now here she was, tumbling into his arms in the middle of his own forest, and his entire body felt like it was on fire. "You're trembling," Cade said, and something in his tone had softened, though he seemed almost annoyed with himself for noticing. "You're the Alpha King," Lyra said, as if that explained everything, which to her, it did. "I'm not going to hurt you." "I know that," she said, though her voice shook. "I'm not scared of you hurting me." "I'm scared of—" She stopped herself, unsure how to finish that sentence, unsure what exactly the strange warmth still humming beneath her skin even meant. Cade studied her for a long moment, And then, slowly, he crouched down and began gathering the fallen moonflowers back into her overturned basket. Lyra stared at him, too startled to move. It seemed impossible, the image of this powerful, feared king, kneeling in the dirt to pick up spilled flowers for an Omega girl who had trespassed on his land. But there he was, doing exactly that, his large hands surprisingly gentle, as he collected each pale bloom. "For your grandmother," he said, holding the basket out to her once it was full again. "You said she was sick." "Yes." Lyra took the basket carefully, her fingers brushing his for only a second, and that same warm jolt raced up her arm again. She pulled back quickly, cheeks burning. "These flowers only grow well on this side of the border," Cade said. "The soil here is richer. If she needs more, you may come back for them." Lyra blinked at him, certain she had misheard. "You're saying I can come onto your land, after I trespassed?" "I'm saying you may come back," he said simply, and there was something in the way he said it, something low and certain, that made her chest tighten strangely. "Thank you," she said softly, and then, because she did not trust herself to say anything else, she turned and hurried back the way she had come, moving as quickly as her clumsy feet would allow, aware the entire time of his gaze following her, until the trees swallowed her from view. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen Cade Ashgrove standing exactly where she left him, one hand pressed flat against his own chest, as though trying to hold his pounding heart in place, staring after her with an expression none of his warriors, none of his advisors, not a single soul in his kingdom, had ever seen on his face before. By the time Lyra reached the river that marked the edge of her own pack's territory, her legs were shaking so badly she had to stop and sit on a flat rock to catch her breath. She looked down at the basket of moonflowers in her lap, their pale petals glowing faintly even in the daylight, and touched her arm where his hands had held her, half expecting to still feel the warmth there. What had just happened to her? She had heard the older Omegas in her pack talk about mates before, about the strange pull some wolves felt toward the one person meant for them, a bond so powerful it could not be denied or explained away. She had always assumed it was the kind of thing that happened to other people, prettier Omegas, graceful ones, not a girl who tripped over her own feet at least twice a day, and had once managed to knock over an entire table of pies at a pack gathering. Surely fate would not waste a bond like that on her. And yet, she thought of the way his golden eyes had widened when he touched her, the way his breath had caught, the way he had knelt in the dirt to gather her spilled flowers without a second thought. Those were not the actions of a king who saw her as nothing. But they could not mean what some small, hopeful part of her wanted them to mean. He was the Alpha King. She was an Omega with no title, no strength, no grace, known throughout her own small pack mostly for the number of things she had accidentally broken. "It doesn't matter," she said aloud to the empty riverbank, trying to convince herself. It was probably nothing. Some strange coincidence. He was just being polite. The moonflowers in her basket seemed to glow a little brighter in response, as if they knew better. She pushed herself up from the rock, wincing at the new bruise forming on her hip from her earlier fall, and made her way back toward the cluster of small wooden homes that made up the heart of the moonlit pack. Smoke curled from chimneys into the morning sky, and she could hear the distant sound of children laughing near the training grounds, the ordinary music of a life she had always known. It felt strange to walk back into that ordinary world carrying a secret so enormous inside her chest. Her grandmother's cottage sat at the edge of the village, a small crooked building with ivy creeping up one wall, and a garden that Agnes had once tended with great pride, before her joints grew too stiff, and her breath too short. Lyra pushed open the door to find her grandmother sitting by the window in her usual chair, a thin blanket over her knees despite the mild weather. "There you are," Agnes said, her voice raspy but warm. "I was starting to worry. You've been gone since sunrise." "I found the flowers," Lyra said, setting the basket down on the small table beside her grandmother's chair. "More than enough for a good long while." Agnes reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the pale blooms, and her tired eyes lit up with pleasure. "These are lovely, dear. Where on earth did you find so many? The patch by the old marker was nearly picked clean last I heard." Lyra hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I found a new patch, a little further than I usually go." "Further? Agnes gave her a shrewd look that made Lyra's stomach flip uncomfortably. as though her grandmother could somehow see straight through her explanation to the truth underneath it. But the old woman said nothing more, simply patted Lyra's hand and asked her to put the kettle on. As Lyra moved around the small kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it over the fire, she found her thoughts drifting back to the forest, to the golden eyes and the low, certain voice, to the strange warmth that still lingered faintly in her fingertips. She told herself firmly that it meant nothing, that a king like Cade Ashgrove would never truly want an Omega like her, that whatever had happened between them in that clearing was some trick of fear and nerves and nothing more. She told herself this several times over the course of the day. She was still telling herself this that evening, lying awake in her narrow bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling of her small room, when she finally admitted to herself that she did not believe a single word of it. Somewhere beyond the river, beyond the old stone marker, in a stone fortress that had never once felt truly like a home, Cade Ashgrove stood at his window staring out at the dark line of the forest, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin, both of them thinking the exact same thought. They had found her. After years of believing they never would, they had finally found her, and now nothing in his entire kingdom would ever feel the same again. Cade's fists were pressed so hard against the stone windowsill that his knuckles had gone white, and still his wolf clawed at him from the inside, demanding he turn around, run back through the forest, and find her again, before another hour passed. He had never felt anything like this in his entire life, not during his hardest battles, not during the long nights he had spent proving himself worthy of his father's throne. This was different. This was a hunger that lived beneath his ribs and refused to be reasoned with. "You look like a man who has seen a ghost," said a voice behind him, and Cade did not need to turn to know it was Gareth, his beta, and closest advisor since childhood. "I found her," Cade said quietly, still staring out at the darkening tree line. Gareth crossed the room slowly, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to sharp attention. "Found who?" "My mate." The words felt strange in Cade's mouth, foreign, as though he were speaking a language he had only just learned. "She crossed the border this morning." "An Omega, from the moonlit pack." For a long moment, Gareth said nothing at all. Then he let out a low breath and dropped into the nearest chair, running a hand through his hair. "You're certain? My wolf has never reacted to anyone the way it reacted to her." Cade finally turned from the window, and Gareth saw immediately that something fundamental had shifted in his friend's face, something that had not been there that morning. "The moment I touched her, it was like a fire lit under my skin. I've never felt anything close to it." "An Omega," Gareth repeated slowly, as though testing how the word sat beside the title of Luna. "From a small border pack. Does it matter where she comes from?" "You know it will matter to the council," Gareth said carefully. "They've spent years pushing you toward alliances, toward strong bloodlines. An Omega with no rank, no training, no political weight behind her name. They won't accept her easily, Cade. You know this." Cade's jaw tightened. He did know it, had known it the moment he watched Lyra stumble away through the trees, her basket of flowers clutched to her chest. He had spent his entire reign building a kingdom strong enough that no rival pack would dare test its borders, and every choice he made, every alliance, every decision, had always been measured first against what would keep his people safe. A mate chosen by fate rather than strategy was not something his council would easily welcome. And yet his wolf did not care one bit about strategy. "I don't intend to ask their permission," Cade said finally, his voice low but absolute. "The bond does not wait for a council's approval, Gareth. You know that better than anyone." Gareth studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Then I suppose I had better start preparing them for the news," he said, though there was a faint, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "For what it's worth, I have never seen you look at anyone the way you're looking right now. Whoever this Omega is, she must be something special." Cade thought of golden petals scattered across dark earth, of frightened brown eyes staring up at him from the forest floor, of the warmth that had spread through his entire body the moment his hands closed around her arms. "She's clumsy," he said, and to his own surprise something like a smile pulled at his lips. "She fell twice in the span of 10 minutes, nearly knocked herself out on a root." Gareth raised an eyebrow. "And this pleases you?" "It shouldn't," Cade admitted, "but it does." Over the following days, Cade found himself unable to focus on anything the way he normally did. He sat through council meetings only half listening, his mind wandering constantly back to the forest, to the memory of her voice trembling, as she apologized for something that had turned out to be the greatest gift of his life. His warriors noticed the change in him almost immediately, the way his sharp temper had softened at the edges, the way he seemed distracted during training, in a manner none of them had ever witnessed from their king. His wolf, for its part, had grown steadily more restless with each day that passed without her. It paced beneath his skin at night, refusing to let him sleep properly, filling his dreams instead with fragmented images of brown hair and golden light and a smile he had barely gotten to see. More than once Cade woke in the middle of the night with his hand outstretched toward an empty space beside him, some deep animal part of him certain, for just a moment, that she should have been there. "This cannot continue," Cade muttered to himself one morning, staring at his own reflection in the polished silver mirror of his chambers, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes that even his advisors had begun to comment on. "I am the Alpha King. I do not lose sleep over an Omega girl I met once in a forest." His wolf answered with a growl of pure disagreement, and Cade found he had no real argument to offer it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river, Lyra was fighting a very similar battle, though with far less power to act on her feelings than the king who thought of her constantly. She threw herself into her usual chores with a fervor that surprised even her, scrubbing floors and mending clothes and tending to her grandmother with an energy that seemed almost desperate, as though enough hard work might scrub the memory of golden eyes from her mind entirely. It did not work. "You've been somewhere else all week," her friend Elsie observed one afternoon as they sat together shelling peas outside Agnes's cottage. Elsie was one of the few Omegas in the pack who had never mocked Lyra for her clumsiness, and over the years, the two had become close, sharing secrets the way sisters might. "What's going on with you?" "Nothing," Lyra said quickly, too quickly, and Elsie's eyebrows rose immediately in suspicion. "Lyra, it's really nothing important." Lyra focused hard on the pea pod in her hands, avoiding Elsie's gaze. "I just haven't been sleeping well." "You've barely eaten anything at meals either. And yesterday, you walked straight into the well pump. You always trip over things, sure, but you've never looked so far away while you were doing it." Elsie set down her bowl and studied her friend carefully. "Did something happen when you went to gather flowers for your grandmother?" Lyra's silence stretched a beat too long, and Elsie's eyes widened. "Something did happen," Elsie said, leaning forward eagerly. "Tell me everything, right now, or I swear I'll ask Edwin to send out a search party to figure out what you're hiding." Reluctantly, glancing around to be sure no one else was within earshot, Lyra told her friend everything. The moonflowers, the growl in the trees, the enormous gray wolf, and the man he had become, tall and powerful, and impossibly, terrifyingly gentle. She told her about the warmth that had raced through her skin the moment his hands touched her arms, about the way his golden eyes had gone wide with something she still could not name, about the way he had knelt in the dirt to gather her spilled flowers, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a king to do. By the time she finished, Elsie's mouth was hanging open. "The Alpha King," she whispered. "Lyra, do you understand what you're describing? That sounds exactly like a mate bond." "It can't be," Lyra said, shaking her head firmly, though her heart gave a painful little lurch at hearing the thought spoken aloud by someone else. "Fate wouldn't waste a bond like that on someone like me. He's a king, Elsie. I trip over my own feet more times in a day than most people do in a month. I once set my own sleeve on fire trying to light the kitchen stove. What would a man like that possibly want with someone like me?" "Fate doesn't care about any of that," Elsie said gently. "That's the whole point of it. It doesn't choose based on grace or rank or how many times a person has knocked over a pie table." Lyra flushed at the memory, which Elsie had clearly not forgotten either. It was one time. It was 3 times, but that's beside the point. Elsie reached over and squeezed her friend's hand. "If it's real, Lyra, you can't just decide it isn't. That's not how any of this works." "Even if it's real," Lyra said quietly, staring down at the small pile of shelled peas between them, "he's still the Alpha King. His council will never accept an Omega with no rank standing beside him. I've heard the stories about what happened to the last few unranked wolves who tried to rise above their station in other packs. It never ends well for them." Elsie had no answer for that, because they both knew it was true. The world they lived in did not tend to reward wolves born without power, no matter how large their hearts might be, and an Omega, daring to imagine herself beside a king, was the kind of dream that could very easily end in heartbreak, or worse. That night, Lyra lay awake, long after the rest of the cottage had gone quiet, listening to the soft, uneven sound of her grandmother's breathing in the next room, and tried once again to convince herself that the whole encounter had been nothing more than a strange coincidence, a trick of fear and nerves that meant nothing at all. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw those golden eyes staring back at her, and every time she flexed her fingers, she swore she could still feel the ghost of his warmth against her skin. She did not know, could not have known, that less than a mile beyond the river, Cade Ashgrove was standing at the very same hour on the balcony of his fortress, staring out at the dark shape of the forest between their two territories, his wolf howling silently beneath his skin, with the exact same unbearable longing. 4 days after their encounter in the forest, Cade finally reached the end of his patience. He stood before his full council in the great stone hall of his fortress, watching the familiar faces of his advisors settle into their seats, and felt his wolf go utterly still inside him, waiting. "I have found my mate," he announced, without preamble, watching carefully as the words landed across the room. A murmur ran through the assembled council immediately, some of it delighted, most of it wary. Lord Callum, the oldest and most cautious of his advisors, leaned forward, with a frown already forming on his weathered face. "Your Majesty, this is welcome news indeed, if true. May we ask which pack she comes from, which bloodline she carries?" "She comes from the Moonlit Pack," Cade said evenly. "She is an Omega." The silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. Callum's frown deepened into something closer to alarm, and several of the other council members exchanged uneasy glances. "An Omega," Callum repeated slowly, as though hoping he had misheard. "Your Majesty, with respect, the Moonlit Pack is a minor border territory. An Omega there would carry no political value whatsoever, no training in leadership, no—" "The bond is not something I chose, Callum," Cade said, his voice sharpening just enough to remind the room exactly who ruled it. "My wolf recognized her the moment I caught her scent. There is no strategy that can override that, and I would not want one even if there were." "Your Majesty, surely you understand our concern," another council member spoke up, more gently than Callum but no less firm. "The pack looks to its Luna for strength and guidance, just as much as it looks to its king. An Omega untrained in matters of rule, unaccustomed to the pressures of court life, might struggle to earn the respect this kingdom demands." Cade's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Gareth, standing quietly at his side, spoke up. "Respect is earned through character, not birth rank," he said. "I have not yet met this young woman, but I trust my king's wolf, and I have never in my life seen it react to anyone the way it reacted to her. That alone should tell this council everything it needs to know." The room fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the crackling of the great fire at the far end of the hall. Cade looked around at the faces of his advisors, men and women who had guided his kingdom for years, whose counsel he genuinely valued even when he disagreed with it, and felt a familiar, stubborn resolve settle deep into his chest. "I did not come here to ask for your blessing," Cade said finally, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "I came here to inform you of what will happen next. In 3 days' time, I will travel to the Moonlit Pack and formally claim her as my mate, before her people and mine both. I would ask for your support in this, but I will proceed regardless of whether it is given." Callum opened his mouth as if to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, sinking back into his chair with a resigned sigh. "Then we will prepare for your journey, Your Majesty," he said quietly, "though I hope, for all our sakes, that this Omega proves herself worthy of the honor you intend to give her." Cade thought of clumsy hands gathering spilled moonflowers, of a trembling voice apologizing for a mistake that had turned out to be fate's greatest gift, and felt a small, fierce smile tug at the corner of his mouth, despite the tension still hanging heavy in the room. "She already has," he said simply, and turned to leave the hall, his wolf finally, blessedly, beginning to settle beneath his skin, now that a plan had been set into motion. 3 days. In 3 days, he would see her again, and this time, nothing on this earth would make him let her go. Word of a grand procession approaching the Moonlit Pack spread through the village before the visitors had even crossed the river. carried by breathless children who came sprinting back from the border with wide eyes and wilder stories. Lyra was kneeling in her grandmother's garden, pulling weeds from around a struggling row of carrots, when Elsie came running up the path so fast she nearly tripped over the low fence. "Lyra," Elsie gasped, out of breath. "You need to come see this right now." "See what?" Lyra sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Elsie, what's wrong?" "Warriors," Elsie managed. "A whole procession of them, coming from the direction of the border. Someone said they saw a banner with a wolf and a crown on it." Lyra's stomach dropped straight through the ground. There was only one banner in the entire region that carried a wolf and a crown together, and the moment Elsie said the words, every ounce of blood seemed to drain from Lyra's face. "That's not possible," she whispered, though even as she said it, some deep instinctive part of her already knew exactly who was coming, and exactly why. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her dirt-stained hands hastily on her apron, and followed Elsie down the path toward the center of the village, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might crack a rib. By the time they reached the main square, a crowd had already gathered, murmuring nervously among themselves, and Lyra could see, at the edge of the village, the unmistakable sight of a procession approaching. Warriors in dark uniforms marched in careful formation, and at their center rode a figure on a tall black horse, whose bearing alone announced exactly who he was, long before anyone could make out his face clearly. Edwin, the alpha of the moonlit pack, stood at the front of the gathered crowd, his weathered face tight with the particular tension of a leader trying to appear calm, while his mind raced through every possible reason the Alpha King might have for visiting his small border territory unannounced. As the procession drew close enough for faces to be seen, Edwin stepped forward, bowing his head in the formal greeting owed to a king of greater standing. "Your Majesty," Edwin said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed square. "This is an unexpected honor." "To what do we owe this visit?" Cade dismounted from his horse with the easy grace of a man entirely comfortable in his own power, and Lyra, standing frozen near the back of the crowd, felt her breath catch painfully in her chest at the sight of him. He looked different than he had in the forest, dressed now in formal dark clothing that emphasized the broad line of his shoulders, a heavy silver chain at his throat marking his rank, but his eyes were exactly as she remembered them, sharp and gold and impossible to look away from. "I have come," Cade announced, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the square, "because a member of your pack has become extremely important to me." A ripple of confused murmuring passed through the crowd. Edwin's brow furrowed. "Important, Your Majesty? I'm afraid I don't understand." 4 days ago," Cade continued, "a young woman from this pack crossed onto my land while gathering flowers. My wolf recognized her scent immediately for what it was. She is my fated mate." The murmuring in the crowd rose sharply into open astonishment. Lyra felt every eye in the square suddenly begin to search the crowd, trying to identify which unlucky, or perhaps incredibly fortunate, young woman had crossed paths with the Alpha King in such a fashion. She wanted desperately to sink into the ground and disappear entirely, but there was nowhere to hide, and she knew, with sinking dread, exactly what was about to happen. "Her name," Cade said, his gaze beginning to sweep across the crowd with obvious purpose, "is Lyra." For one terrible, frozen moment, absolute silence fell over the entire square. Then every head turned toward her at once, and Lyra felt her face burn crimson under the weight of 100 staring eyes. She heard whispers immediately begin to ripple outward, some disbelieving, some openly scornful. "Lyra, the clumsy one? Surely there's some mistake. She can barely carry a basket without dropping it. How could she possibly be a king's mate?" Each whisper landed like a small blow, and Lyra felt her carefully built composure beginning to crack apart. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear into her grandmother's cottage and never come out again, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground, frozen beneath the weight of Cade's steady golden gaze, finding her at last across the crowded square. And then, as if fate had decided her humiliation was not yet complete, Lyra's foot caught against an uneven cobblestone as she instinctively tried to step backward away from the attention, and she stumbled hard, arms flailing, landing directly in a half-full water trough at the edge of the square, with a tremendous splash that sent water spraying across several nearby onlookers. The silence that followed was, if possible, even worse than the whispers had been. Lyra sat in the trough for a long, mortifying moment, soaked from head to toe, water dripping from her hair into her stunned eyes, absolutely certain that this was, without question, the single worst moment of her entire life. Somewhere in the crowd, she heard someone stifle a laugh, quickly silenced by an elbow to the ribs, and she felt tears of pure humiliation beginning to burn behind her eyes. She expected mockery. She expected the king to turn away in disgust, to realize immediately that whatever strange trick of fate had drawn him to her must surely have been a mistake, that no king could possibly want an Omega so hopeless she could not even stand in a crowded square without falling into a trough of water. Instead, Cade crossed the square in a few swift strides and knelt beside the trough, extending his hand to her without a trace of amusement or disgust on his face, only a warm, steady concern that made Lyra's chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that it seemed meant only for her, even though the whole square could surely still hear it. "I'm fine," Lyra managed, mortified beyond words, refusing at first to take his offered hand. "Please, just go. I'm sure this was all some terrible mistake, and I don't want to embarrass you any further in front of your people." Something in Cade's expression shifted, a flash of something fierce and protective crossing his sharp features. "You have embarrassed no one," he said firmly, loud enough now for the crowd to hear clearly. "If anyone in this square laughs at my mate again, they will answer to me directly." The square fell into instant, absolute silence. Lyra finally looked up at him properly, water still dripping from her soaked hair, and found herself utterly unable to look away from the intensity in his golden eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his, and he pulled her up out of the trough with easy strength, steadying her the moment her feet touched solid ground again, just as he had done in the forest days before. "You truly meant what you said," she whispered, still not quite able to believe it. "About me being your mate. I have never meant anything more in my entire life," Cade said, and the raw honesty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold water soaking through her dress. Edwin cleared his throat carefully from a few steps away, clearly trying to navigate the delicate situation unfolding in the middle of his own village square. "Your Majesty," he said, "perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, where the young lady can dry off and gather herself properly." Cade nodded, though he made no move to release Lyra's hand, and together, they walked toward the largest building in the village, the modest meeting hall where Edwin conducted pack business, trailed by a wide-eyed crowd that clearly had no intention of missing a single moment more of this astonishing turn of events. Inside the meeting hall, Lyra sat wrapped in a spare blanket someone had hurriedly found for her, still dripping slightly onto the wooden floor, while Edwin and Cade discussed the formalities of the situation in low, careful voices nearby. Elsie sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly, practically vibrating, with barely contained excitement, despite the tension in the room. "I can't believe this is happening," Elsie whispered. "You're going to be a queen." "I don't want to be a queen," Lyra whispered back, her voice trembling. "I want to be someone he doesn't regret choosing. Did you see how everyone looked at me out there? They think I'm a joke, Elsie. They think this is some kind of mistake." "Forget what they think," Elsie said firmly. "Did you see the way he looked at you when you fell into that trough? That wasn't the look of a man who regrets anything." Before Lyra could answer, Cade approached them both, and Elsie quickly excused herself with a knowing smile, leaving the two of them alone at the edge of the room. Cade lowered himself onto the bench beside Lyra, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite her still damp clothes. "You've been avoiding my eyes since we came inside," he observed quietly. "I'm trying to understand why you're doing this," Lyra admitted, finally looking up at him. "You're a king. You could have any wolf in this entire region as your mate, someone graceful, someone trained to stand beside you, someone who wouldn't embarrass you in front of your own people within 5 minutes of meeting them. I don't want any wolf in this region," Cade said. "I want you. My wolf chose you, Lyra, and my wolf has never once been wrong about anything important in its entire life. Do you think I care that you fell into a trough of water? I have watched grown warriors freeze in fear at the mere sight of me. You apologized to a wolf you believed might kill you, and then worried more about my flowers than your own safety. That tells me more about your character than any amount of grace ever could." Lyra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes again, though this time they had nothing to do with humiliation. "Everyone out there thinks this is a mistake," she said softly. "Your council will think it too. What happens when they realize I have no training, no rank, nothing to offer a kingdom like yours? You have already offered me something no one else in this world has ever given me," Cade said, his voice low and rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You have given my wolf peace, for the first time in its entire existence. That is not nothing, Lyra. That is everything." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his words settling gently into the space between them. Lyra studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and found none at all, only a steady, unwavering certainty that slowly began to loosen the tight knot of fear in her chest. "I'm frightened," she admitted finally, the words barely more than a whisper. "Of failing you. Of failing your kingdom." "Then we will face that fear together," Cade said simply, reaching over to take her hand once more, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "I am not asking you to become someone else, Lyra. I am asking you to become my Luna exactly as you are, clumsy feet and gentle heart included." Something in Lyra's chest finally cracked open, releasing a warmth she had been holding back since the moment she first saw him standing in the forest. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together properly for the first time, and felt that same electric warmth she remembered from before spread gently up her arm, softer now, steadier, like a promise rather than a shock. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll try. I'll try to be worthy of this, of you." "You already are," Cade said, and the smile that spread across his sharp, serious face transformed him entirely, softening every hard line, until he looked, for just a moment, like an ordinary young man, rather than the feared Alpha King of an entire region. "You already are, and you always will be." Outside the meeting hall, the crowd had begun to disperse slowly, the initial shock of the announcement settling into something closer to cautious curiosity, though whispers still trailed through the village well into the evening. Edwin stood near the doorway, watching the two of them together with a thoughtful expression, and when Cade finally rose to speak with him about the formal arrangements ahead, the older Alpha nodded slowly, something like approval crossing his weathered features. "She has always had a good heart," Edwin said quietly, glancing back toward where Lyra sat wrapped in her blanket, cheeks still flushed, but her eyes now bright with something that looked almost like hope. "I confess I did not expect fate to recognize that in quite this way, but perhaps I should not be surprised. The kindest hearts are so often overlooked." "Not anymore," Cade said firmly, and there was a promise in those two simple words that Edwin did not fail to notice. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the trees, and the village slowly settled into its usual evening quiet, Lyra sat once more beside her grandmother's window, still trying to process the impossible turn her life had taken in the span of a single afternoon. Agnes reached over and patted her hand gently, her tired eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like pride. "I always told you," Agnes said softly, "that a heart as kind as yours would find its reward eventually. I simply did not expect the reward to arrive wearing a crown." Lyra laughed despite herself, a small, shaky sound that released some of the tension still coiled tight in her chest. "I'm still frightened, grandmother. What if I can't be what he needs? What if his people never accept me?" "Then you will show them, slowly and steadily, exactly who you are," Agnes said, "the same way you have shown me every single day of your life. Kindness has a way of winning arguments that strength never can, my dear. Give it time, and trust that man's wolf. It chose well." Outside, the first stars began to appear over the dark line of the forest that separated the two territories, and somewhere beyond that border, in a stone fortress that had never quite felt like home, Cade Ashgrove stood once more at his window, though this time his wolf was calm and quiet beneath his skin, settled at last, patient, knowing that soon enough, the woman fate had chosen for him would come to stay for good. The morning Lyra was meant to leave for the kingdom, she woke before dawn to the sound of her own heart pounding, convinced for one disoriented moment that the entire past week had been nothing more than an especially vivid dream. But when she opened her eyes and saw the small trunk sitting packed and ready near her door, filled with the few belongings she owned, the truth settled over her all at once, heavy and undeniable. Today she would leave the only home she had ever known. She found Agnes already awake in the kitchen, moving slowly around the small space with the careful, deliberate motions of someone whose body no longer cooperated easily with her will, but who refused to let that stop her from making one last pot of tea for her granddaughter. "You didn't need to get up so early," Lyra said softly, crossing the room to take the kettle from her grandmother's shaking hands. "I wasn't about to let you leave without a proper breakfast," Agnes said, settling into her chair with a small, contented sigh. "Even queens need to eat, dear." "I'm not a queen yet," Lyra said, though the word still sent a strange thrill of fear and excitement through her chest every time she heard it. "I'm barely anything yet, just a girl leaving home for the first time." "You are exactly what you have always been," Agnes said firmly, reaching across the table to take Lyra's hand in her own frail fingers. "A kind heart, in a world that does not always know what to do with kindness. That will not change simply because you are moving to a bigger house." Lyra laughed, despite the tightness in her throat, though the laugh quickly dissolved into something closer to tears. "I'm going to miss you terribly," she whispered. "What if something happens to you while I'm gone? What if you need me and I'm too far away to come? Then you will send for me, and Cade Ashgrove will personally see to it that I am brought to you in comfort. Or I will have a great deal to say to that young man about it," Agnes said with a small, wry smile. "Do not waste your worry on an old woman, Lyra. Save it instead for learning how to walk across a formal dining hall without breaking anything important." Despite herself, Lyra laughed again, this time more genuinely, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their tea as the sun slowly rose outside the window, casting warm golden light across the small kitchen that had been the center of Lyra's entire world for as long as she could remember. By mid-morning, a small procession had gathered outside the cottage to escort her to the border, where Cade himself would be waiting to accompany her the rest of the way. Elsie stood at the front of the small crowd, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve, clearly torn between excitement for her friend's future and grief at losing her daily company. "You had better send word the moment you arrive," Elsie said, hugging Lyra tightly. "And you had better not forget about me once you're surrounded by fancy nobles and important business." "I could never forget you," Lyra promised, hugging her friend back just as fiercely. "You're the only reason I survived growing up in this pack without losing my mind entirely." "Someone had to keep you from setting yourself on fire," Elsie said, laughing through her tears, and the two friends held on to each other for a long moment, before finally, reluctantly, letting go. Edwin approached next, his weathered face solemn, but not unkind. "You have always been a credit to this pack, Lyra," he said. "I expect you will be a credit to your new one as well, whatever the doubters might say. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." "Thank you, Edwin," Lyra said, genuinely touched by his words, "for everything, for never treating me differently, even when others did." With her farewells finally spoken and her small trunk secured onto the waiting cart, Lyra climbed up beside the driver and allowed herself one last long look at the cottage where she had spent her entire life, at her grandmother, standing in the doorway with tears shining in her tired eyes, at the familiar cluster of small wooden homes and the winding dirt paths she had walked 1,000 times before. Then the cart began to move, and slowly, steadily, her old life fell away behind her. The journey to the border took less than an hour, but it felt to Lyra like crossing into an entirely different world. When the cart finally stopped near the old stone marker, she saw Cade waiting for her, mounted on his tall black horse, flanked by a small honor guard of warriors in formal dark uniforms. The moment his golden eyes found her, something in his expression softened visibly, the tension in his shoulders easing, as though he had been holding his breath since the moment she left his sight days before. "You came," he said, dismounting swiftly, to help her down from the cart himself. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Lyra asked, allowing him to take her hand and steady her as her feet touched solid ground. "I worried," Cade admitted quietly, "that once you had time to think it over properly, you might decide the whole thing was too much of a risk." "I did think it over," Lyra said honestly. "I thought about very little else, if I'm being truthful, but I made a promise to you, and I intend to keep it, even if I'm terrified out of my mind." Something in his face shifted at her honesty, a warmth spreading across his sharp features that made him look, for just a moment, entirely unlike the feared king his own people whispered about. "We will face it together," he said, echoing the promise he had made her days before, and this time, Lyra felt herself believe it more fully than she had before. The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of unfamiliar scenery, the dense forest gradually giving way to open fields, and, eventually, the first distant glimpse of Cade's fortress, rising against the horizon. Lyra had imagined it many times in the days since their first meeting, but nothing had prepared her for the actual sight of it. An enormous structure of pale gray stone, with towers reaching high into the sky, surrounded by a bustling town that seemed to stretch in every direction. "It's beautiful," she breathed, unable to hide her awe as they drew closer. "It has never quite felt like home to me," Cade admitted, riding close enough beside the cart that his knee occasionally brushed against her shoulder. "My father built most of it during his reign. I have always found it rather cold and imposing, if I'm honest." "Perhaps that will change," Lyra said softly. Cade glanced over at her, something hopeful flickering behind his golden eyes. "Perhaps it will." As they passed through the massive gates and into the fortress courtyard, Lyra became acutely aware of the many eyes now turning to watch her arrival, servants and warriors alike pausing in their tasks to catch a glimpse of the Omega who had somehow captured their king's attention. She felt her cheeks flush under the weight of so much curious attention, and instinctively reached for Cade's hand, grateful when his fingers closed around hers immediately, steady and reassuring. Gareth met them at the base of the wide stone steps leading up to the main entrance, his expression open and friendly, in a way that immediately put Lyra at ease. "So this is the young woman who has turned our king's entire world upside down," he said, offering her a warm smile and a respectful bow. "It is an honor to finally meet you properly, Lyra. I have heard a great deal about you this past week." "All good things, I hope," Lyra said, managing a small, nervous smile of her own. "Mostly good things," Gareth said with a teasing grin, glancing sideways at Cade, "though I understand there was a rather dramatic incident involving a water trough." Lyra groaned, covering her burning face with her free hand, while Cade let out a low chuckle beside her, the sound rich and warm, in a way that seemed to surprise even the guards standing nearby, who exchanged glances of open astonishment at hearing their stern king laugh so freely. As they climbed the wide stone steps toward the fortress entrance, Lyra caught sight of a figure standing near one of the upper windows, watching the arrival below with an expression that, even from a distance, seemed far less welcoming than anyone else's had been. A striking young woman, with sleek dark hair and sharp, calculating eyes, stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed intently on Lyra, with an intensity that sent an unexpected chill down her spine. "Who is that?" Lyra asked quietly, nodding subtly toward the window. Cade followed her gaze, and something in his expression flickered, though he quickly smoothed it away. "That is Seraphine," he said, "a she-wolf from an allied pack who has spent considerable time at court over the years. Pay her no mind." But even as they continued into the fortress, Lyra found she could not quite shake the memory of that cold, watchful stare, or the strange, prickling sense that not everyone within these walls would welcome her arrival with open arms. The interior of the fortress was even grander than Lyra had imagined, with soaring ceilings and polished stone floors that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Servants moved efficiently through the wide corridors, casting curious glances her way as she passed, and Lyra found herself gripping Cade's hand a little tighter with each new hallway they entered, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the world she was now expected to call home. "This is a great deal to take in all at once," she admitted quietly, as they finally reached a set of ornate double doors leading into what appeared to be a private wing of the fortress. "You do not need to master it all today," Cade said gently, pausing to look at her properly, his thumb tracing a comforting circle across the back of her hand. "Take whatever time you need. I will be here, and so will Gareth, and there is no rush for you to become someone you are not simply to satisfy expectations that were never truly yours to meet in the first place." Lyra looked up at him, at the sincerity written plainly across his sharp, handsome face, and felt some of the tightness in her chest finally begin to ease. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being patient with me." "You are worth an infinite amount of patience," Cade said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled something deep and anxious inside her that had been trembling since the moment she left her grandmother's cottage that morning. Later that evening, after Lyra had been shown to her new chambers, A spacious room far grander than anything she had ever slept in before. She sat alone by the window, looking out over the sprawling fortress grounds bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it also felt entirely foreign, a world away from the small wooden cottage and familiar dirt paths she had left behind that very morning. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find a kind-faced young servant woman standing there, holding a tray of tea and small pastries. "I thought you might like something before bed, my lady," the woman said, offering a warm smile that immediately put Lyra at ease. "My name is Flora. If there is anything at all you need during your time here, please do not hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Flora," Lyra said, genuinely grateful for the kindness. "I appreciate that more than you know." As Flora set down the tray and began to leave, she paused at the door and glanced back with a thoughtful expression. "If I may say so, my lady, the whole fortress has been buzzing about your arrival all week. Most of us are quite curious to meet the woman who managed to soften our king's temper so quickly. He has not smiled so easily in all the years I have served here." The words settled warmly into Lyra's chest, easing some of the loneliness that had crept in since she first sat down by the window. Perhaps, she thought, watching Flora disappear back down the corridor, this strange new world would not be quite so impossible to navigate after all. Perhaps, given enough time and patience, she might even come to think of it as home. But even as that small hopeful thought took root, she could not quite forget the image of Seraphine standing silently at that upper window, watching her arrival with eyes as sharp and cold as winter frost, and some small cautious part of her understood that not every battle ahead would be fought against her own clumsiness or self-doubt. A sharp knock at her door pulled Lyra from a restless sleep, and she sat up quickly, heart already racing before she had even fully opened her eyes. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her new chambers, and for one disoriented moment she forgot entirely where she was, until the unfamiliar grandeur of the room reminded her all at once. "My lady," Flora called through the door, her voice carrying a note of urgency Lyra had not heard from her before. "You must dress quickly. The formal council gathering has been moved to this morning instead of tomorrow as planned." Lyra's stomach dropped. "This morning? Why the sudden change?" Flora entered as soon as Lyra called for her to come in, already carrying a beautiful gown of deep blue fabric over one arm, her expression carefully neutral, in a way that told Lyra the news was not entirely good. "Lord Callum insisted, my lady. He believes the sooner the council formally assesses your suitability, the sooner the matter can be settled, one way or another." "Settled," Lyra repeated, feeling the word land heavily in her chest. "You mean they still might reject me?" "His Majesty would never allow that," Flora said firmly, helping Lyra into the gown with quick, practiced hands. "But the council does hold certain traditional rights regarding the formal recognition of a Luna, particularly one without prior standing. It is mostly ceremonial, my lady. Try not to worry too much." Despite Flora's reassurances, Lyra's hands trembled as she smoothed the unfamiliar fabric of her gown, staring at her own reflection in the tall mirror across the room. She barely recognized herself, dressed in silk finer than anything she had ever worn, her dark hair carefully arranged by Flora's skilled fingers into an elegant style that made her look, for the first time in her life, almost like she belonged in a place like this. Almost. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Lyra asked quietly. "What if I trip walking into the hall, or spill something during the ceremony, and give them exactly the excuse they're looking for to send me home? Then you will stand back up, apologize with grace, and continue on," Flora said gently, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "My lady, if I may be so bold, I have served in this fortress for many years, and I have watched a great many important people walk through these halls. Very few of them treated the servants and guards the way you have already treated me and everyone else you have met since arriving. That matters more than any council will ever admit, but it matters all the same." Lyra managed a small, grateful smile, though her nerves remained tightly coiled as Flora finished the final touches and led her out into the wide corridor, toward the great hall where the council waited. Cade met her just outside the towering doors, and the moment he saw her, something in his expression shifted so completely that Lyra felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her the way she imagined a man might look at something precious and rare, and despite her nerves, a small measure of warmth crept back into her chest at the sight of him. "You look magnificent," he said softly, taking her hand and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I feel like I might be sick," Lyra admitted honestly, and Cade let out a low chuckle, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "You will be wonderful," he said. "Whatever happens in there, remember that my choice in this matter is already made. The council may offer their opinions, but they do not hold the power to undo a mate bond, no matter how strongly some of them might wish otherwise." With that small comfort settled firmly in her chest, Lyra took a deep breath and allowed Cade to lead her through the towering doors into the great hall, where the full council sat assembled along a long table, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open skepticism. Lord Callum rose first as they entered, his sharp eyes sweeping over Lyra with clinical assessment. "Welcome, my lady," he said, his tone polite but cool. "We have gathered today to formally consider the recognition of your position as Luna of this kingdom. I trust His Majesty has explained the nature of this proceeding." "He has," Lyra said, proud that her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I understand you have concerns about my suitability, given my background. I would ask only that you judge me by my actions rather than my birth, if you are willing to give me that chance." A flicker of surprise crossed several faces around the table at her directness, and Callum's eyebrows rose slightly. "A fair request," he admitted after a moment. "Tell us then, what do you believe you can offer this kingdom, given that you arrive without formal training in leadership or diplomacy?" Lyra thought carefully before answering, aware of Cade's steady presence beside her, his hand still resting protectively at the small of her back. "I cannot offer you strategic alliances or years of diplomatic experience," she said honestly, "but I have spent my entire life caring for others, without expecting anything in return, tending to my grandmother, helping neighbors who could not help themselves, and listening carefully to people that others often overlooked. I believe a kingdom is only as strong as the way it treats its most vulnerable people, and that is something I understand deeply, from lived experience rather than lessons in a formal hall." The room fell into a thoughtful silence, and Lyra watched several council members exchange considering glances. Even Callum's expression softened slightly, though he remained carefully neutral. "A noble sentiment," said another council member, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun. "But sentiment alone does not defend a border or negotiate a treaty, my dear. Are you prepared for the very real demands this position will place upon you?" "I am prepared to learn," Lyra said firmly. "I do not expect to master everything overnight, and I would be foolish to pretend otherwise. But I am willing to work harder than anyone in this room can imagine, if given the chance to prove myself over time, rather than being judged entirely on this single morning." Cade's hand tightened slightly at her back, a silent gesture of support and pride that steadied Lyra further. The council members conferred quietly among themselves for several long, tense minutes, and Lyra forced herself to stand tall and still, resisting the urge to fidget nervously, despite every instinct screaming at her to do exactly that. Finally, Callum rose again, addressing the room with the formal weight befitting his position. "The council will grant a probationary recognition," he announced. "You will be formally introduced to the court and the wider kingdom as His Majesty's chosen mate, with full recognition of the Luna title to follow after a suitable period of demonstrated commitment. This is, I believe, a fair compromise, given the unusual circumstances." Lyra felt a wave of relief wash through her, though it was tempered by the awareness that a probationary period meant continued scrutiny, continued opportunity for failure in the eyes of those still watching her closely. Still, it was far better than outright rejection, and she found herself genuinely grateful for the chance, however conditional. "Thank you," she said sincerely, bowing her head slightly toward the assembled council. "I will not take this opportunity lightly." As the council began to disperse, Cade guided Lyra toward a quieter corner of the hall, his expression warm with unmistakable pride. "You handled that far better than I expected, even the most seasoned diplomat to manage," he said. "I confess, I was prepared to override their decision entirely, if things had gone poorly, but you needed no rescuing at all." "I was terrified the entire time," Lyra admitted, finally allowing herself to exhale the breath she felt she had been holding since Flora first knocked on her door that morning. "Terrified or not, you stood your ground with more grace than half the nobles who have sat in that hall over the years," Cade said, reaching up to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering softly against her cheek. "I am proud of you, Lyra. More proud than I know how to properly express." The warmth in his voice sent a pleasant shiver through her entire body, and for a moment, standing there in the quiet corner of the grand hall, Lyra allowed herself to simply enjoy the closeness between them, the steady comfort of his presence after such a stressful morning. That evening, a formal feast was held to mark her official introduction to the wider court, and Lyra found herself dressed once more in fine silk, seated beside Cade at the head of a long table filled with unfamiliar faces, all of them curious, some openly skeptical, watching her every move with careful attention. She focused hard on remembering the etiquette Flora had hastily taught her that afternoon, which fork to use for which course, how to greet visiting nobles with the proper formal address, and managed, for the most part, to avoid any major missteps. It was near the end of the meal, as servants began clearing the final course, that Seraphine approached the table for the first time since Lyra's arrival, gliding gracefully toward them with a smile that did not quite reach her sharp, calculating eyes. "My lady," Seraphine said smoothly, addressing Lyra with exaggerated warmth, "what a pleasure to finally meet the woman who has captured our king's attention so thoroughly. I must say, you handled the council remarkably well this morning, especially for someone with no formal training whatsoever." The comment was delivered with such careful sweetness that it took Lyra a moment to fully register the subtle insult buried within it. Before she could formulate a response, Seraphine continued, turning her attention pointedly toward Cade. "It has been far too long since you last invited me to hunt with you, Cade," Seraphine said, her voice dropping into something warmer, more familiar than Lyra felt entirely comfortable with. "We used to enjoy such wonderful runs together, before you became so occupied with other matters." "Circumstances have changed, Seraphine," Cade said evenly, his tone polite but noticeably cool. "I trust you are settling back into court life comfortably enough." "Of course," Seraphine said, her smile widening slightly, as her gaze flicked back toward Lyra, with something sharp and assessing, hidden beneath the surface pleasantness. "I do hope you will forgive me if I seem overly protective of our king's well-being, my lady. I have known him for many years, long before you arrived in his life, and I only wish to see him truly happy." "I understand completely," Lyra said carefully, refusing to let the underlying challenge in Seraphine's words rattle her composure. "I hope we can become friends, in time." Something flickered across Seraphine's face, there and gone too quickly to properly identify, before she offered a final, brittle smile, and excused herself gracefully from the table. Lyra watched her retreat across the hall, and felt a familiar prickle of unease settle once more beneath her skin, the same feeling she had experienced upon first glimpsing Seraphine watching from that upper window on the day of her arrival. "You handled her well," Cade murmured quietly, once Seraphine was safely out of earshot. "She doesn't like me," Lyra observed, watching the elegant she-wolf disappear into the crowd of nobles still lingering after the feast. "Seraphine has never particularly liked anyone who threatens what she believes should belong to her," Cade said, his jaw tightening slightly. "I would advise caution around her, Lyra. She has ambitions that extend well beyond simple friendship, and she has never taken kindly to disappointment." "What kind of ambitions?" Lyra asked, though some instinctive part of her already suspected the answer, before Cade even spoke it aloud. "She has made her interest in becoming Luna known to this court for several years now," Cade admitted. "I never once returned that interest, but her pride has not fully accepted that fact, even now." Lyra absorbed this information carefully, filing it away alongside the memory of Seraphine's cold, calculating stare from that very first day. She did not yet know exactly what challenges lay ahead in navigating this new, complicated world of court politics and hidden ambitions, but she understood, with growing certainty, that not every obstacle in her path forward would be as simple to overcome as a probationary council review or an unfamiliar formal dinner. Later that night, as Lyra prepared for bed in the quiet privacy of her chambers, she found herself replaying the entire day in her mind. The terrifying council review, the surprising warmth of Cade's pride, the sharp, hidden edges beneath Seraphine's polished smile. It had been, without question, the most overwhelming day of her entire life, and yet, underneath all the exhaustion and lingering nerves, she felt something else too, something small but steadily growing. She felt, for the first time since arriving at this grand, unfamiliar fortress, the faint but unmistakable beginnings of belief that she might actually be able to make a place for herself here. Clumsy feet, uncertain heart, and all. 3 weeks into her new life at the fortress, Lyra stood in the training yard just after dawn, watching a group of young warriors run through their morning drills, with a kind of fascinated envy she had not expected to feel. She had woken early again, unable to sleep properly, her mind still adjusting to the strange rhythms of court life, and had wandered outside simply to clear her head before the day's lessons began. "You're up early, my lady," came a friendly voice from behind her, and Lyra turned to find a young warrior approaching, his easy smile immediately putting her at ease. He was broad-shouldered and sandy-haired, with the kind of open, cheerful face that seemed entirely unbothered by rank or formality. "I couldn't sleep," Lyra admitted. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," the warrior said, offering a small bow. "Bram, my lady, at your service. I've heard a great deal about you these past few weeks, though I confess most of it has been considerably kinder than the gossip I expected when word first spread about the king's mate." Lyra raised an eyebrow, curious despite herself. "What kind of gossip did you expect?" "Honestly, most of us assumed some proud noblewoman would be arriving, someone who would look down her nose at the rest of us common warriors and servants," Bram admitted with a sheepish grin. "Instead, half the kitchen staff has already decided you're their favorite person in the entire fortress, on account of the fact that you actually remember their names and ask after their families." Warmth spread through Lyra's chest at his words, a welcome contrast to the careful scrutiny she still felt from certain corners of the court. "I don't understand why that would be so unusual," she said honestly. "They're the ones who keep this entire fortress running smoothly. It seems only right to treat them with respect." "You'd be surprised how rare that attitude is among nobles," Bram said, shaking his head slightly. "Most of the high-born wolves who pass through these halls barely acknowledge the staff exists at all, let alone bother learning their names." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cade himself, striding across the training yard with the easy authority that seemed to follow him everywhere, though his expression softened considerably the moment he spotted Lyra standing near the edge of the yard. "I see you've met Bram," Cade said, coming to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed lightly against hers. "One of my most promising young warriors, though also one of my most incorrigible." "I prefer the term charming, Your Majesty," Bram said with an unrepentant grin, earning a dry look from Cade that nonetheless carried no real irritation behind it. "Would you like to try?" Cade asked suddenly, turning his attention back to Lyra, gesturing toward the training yard, where several warriors had paused their drills to watch the exchange with open curiosity. "Try what exactly?" Lyra asked warily. "Training," Cade said simply. "Nothing dangerous, I promise. Simple footwork drills, the kind we teach to those just beginning. I think you might surprise yourself." Lyra hesitated, painfully aware of her own reputation for clumsiness, certain that stepping into a training yard full of skilled warriors could only end in fresh humiliation. But something in Cade's steady, encouraging expression, and the genuine curiosity on Bram's friendly face, made her reconsider. "All right," she said finally, squaring her shoulders with more confidence than she actually felt. "But if I fall flat on my face in front of everyone, I'm blaming you entirely." Cade's answering smile was warm enough to chase away most of her remaining nerves, and over the next hour, under his patient instruction, Lyra found herself slowly, haltingly, beginning to understand the basic rhythm of the footwork drills he demonstrated. She stumbled more than once, of course, and the assembled warriors politely pretended not to notice the 2 occasions she nearly toppled over entirely, but by the end of the session, she had managed to complete an entire sequence without falling, earning genuine applause from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. "You did wonderfully," Cade said afterward, pulling her gently against his side as they walked back toward the fortress, both of them slightly out of breath from the exertion. "I nearly fell 4 separate times," Lyra pointed out, though she couldn't quite suppress the pleased smile tugging at her lips. "And you caught yourself every single time," Cade countered. "That resilience matters far more than natural grace, Lyra. I have trained warriors with beautiful form, who crumble the moment things go wrong. You simply keep going, no matter how many times you stumble." His words settled warmly into her chest, and Lyra found herself, in that moment, feeling more at home in this strange new world than she had since her arrival weeks before. Over the following days, that small training session became something of a regular occurrence, And slowly, gradually, Lyra found herself building genuine friendships among the warriors and staff who had initially regarded her with cautious curiosity. It was not all smooth progress, however. She still occasionally caught curious, judging stares from certain nobles at court, still overheard the occasional whispered comment questioning her suitability for the role fate had chosen for her. And always, at the edges of every gathering, there was Seraphine, watching with those same sharp, calculating eyes, her polite smile never quite reaching the coldness beneath it. One afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival, Lyra was walking through the fortress gardens with Flora, discussing the upcoming autumn festival that the entire kingdom would soon be celebrating, when they came upon a small cluster of noblewomen gathered near one of the ornamental fountains, their voices carrying just far enough for certain words to reach Lyra's ears, before the group noticed her approach. "Simply cannot understand what he sees in her," one voice was saying. An Omega with no training whatsoever, expected to stand beside him at such an important gathering. It's practically an embarrassment to the entire court. "I heard she nearly caused a diplomatic incident just last week," another voice added, spilling wine directly onto Lord Callum's finest robes during a private dinner. Lyra's face flushed hot with humiliation, the memory of that particular mishap still fresh and painful in her mind. She had indeed spilled wine on Callum's robes, though it had been an honest accident during an especially tense conversation, and Callum himself had been gracious enough about it afterward, but clearly the story had already spread through court in a far less generous version. Flora noticed Lyra's stricken expression and gently touched her arm. "Pay them no mind, my lady," she murmured quietly. "Idle gossip has a way of growing teeth it never actually possessed." But the damage had already been done, at least emotionally, and Lyra found herself withdrawing slightly for the rest of the day, second-guessing every small gesture and word, wondering how many similarly exaggerated stories were circulating through the court behind her back, wondering whether her recent progress had truly meant anything at all, if this was still how so many people viewed her. That evening, Cade found her sitting alone in the fortress library, staring blankly at a book she had not actually been reading, and immediately recognized the troubled set of her shoulders. "Something is bothering you," he said, settling into the seat beside her without hesitation. Reluctantly, Lyra told him about the conversation she had overheard, about the exaggerated story of the wine incident, about the persistent doubt that seemed to follow her no matter how hard she worked to prove herself worthy of her new position. Cade listened silently, his jaw tightening with each detail, and when she finished, he reached over to take her hand firmly in his. "Gossip will always exist among people with too much time and too little kindness," he said. "But I want you to understand something clearly, Lyra. Every single person who actually matters in this fortress, the staff who serve you, the warriors who train with you, Gareth, myself, we have all watched you work harder these past weeks than anyone had any right to expect. That effort has not gone unnoticed, whatever a handful of bored nobles might whisper behind closed doors." "It's hard not to let it get to me," Lyra admitted quietly. "I keep thinking, what if they're right? What if I really am an embarrassment, and everyone is simply too polite to say it to my face?" "They are not right," Cade said firmly, his golden eyes fierce with conviction, as he turned to face her fully. "You have taken every single challenge placed before you, and met it with more grace and determination than most nobles born to this life could ever manage. I chose you, Lyra, not despite your background, but because of the character that background built in you. I would not trade that for 100 perfectly trained, perfectly graceful noblewomen." Something in his words, in the raw sincerity behind them, finally cracked through the doubt that had settled so heavily over Lyra since overhearing that cruel conversation by the fountain. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and felt his arm come around her immediately, solid and warm and steady. "Thank you," she whispered, "for always believing in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself." "Always," Cade said simply, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and for a long while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the quiet library around them, the only witness to the steadily deepening bond, growing between them, with each passing day. What neither of them noticed, in that private, tender moment, was the figure who had paused just outside the library doors moments earlier, drawn by the sound of voices, and who now stood frozen in the shadowed corridor, listening with growing, bitter resentment to every word of comfort Cade offered so freely, to the Omega girl who had stolen the future Seraphine had spent years carefully planning for herself. Seraphine's hands curled into tight fists at her sides as she finally turned and walked away, her mind already beginning to churn with the first careful threads of a plan, far more dangerous than idle gossip whispered by bored noblewomen near a garden fountain. The autumn festival arrived on a crisp golden morning, and the entire fortress had been transformed overnight into something out of a dream. Banners of deep red and gold hanging from every tower, long tables set up throughout the courtyard groaning under the weight of harvest food, musicians already tuning their instruments near the central square. It was, Flora explained excitedly, while helping Lyra dress that morning, the single most important celebration of the entire year, a tradition stretching back generations, marking the end of harvest season and the beginning of the kingdom's preparations for winter. And this year, Flora added, carefully arranging a crown of woven autumn leaves and small white flowers atop Lyra's dark hair, you will be the one to formally open the festival, my lady. It is traditionally the Luna's honor to do so. Lyra's stomach twisted with immediate anxiety. I've never done anything like that before. What exactly am I supposed to say? A simple blessing over the harvest, thanking the land and the pack for another year of survival, Flora said reassuringly. His Majesty will stand beside you the entire time. You need only speak from the heart, my lady. That has always been your greatest strength. Despite Flora's confident reassurance, Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she made her way down to the courtyard later that morning, where what seemed like the entire kingdom had gathered, filling every available space with excited chatter and laughter. Cade waited for her near a raised wooden platform at the center of the square, dressed in formal ceremonial robes that made him look every inch the powerful king his people knew him to be, and the moment he saw her approaching, his entire face softened with unmistakable warmth. You look beautiful, he murmured, taking her hand as she climbed the platform steps beside him. Ready? Not remotely, Lyra admitted under her breath, earning a low chuckle from him, just as the assembled crowd fell into expectant silence. She spoke the traditional words Flora had helped her memorize the night before, her voice growing steadier with each sentence as she looked out over the sea of faces watching her. Farmers and warriors and children and elders, all of them part of this kingdom she was slowly learning to call her own. When she finished, a warm round of applause rippled through the courtyard, and Lyra felt a genuine swell of pride loosen the tight knot of anxiety that had been coiled in her chest all morning. The festival unfolded beautifully throughout the day, filled with music and dancing and games that had the children of the fortress shrieking with delighted laughter. Lyra found herself thoroughly enjoying the celebration, chatting easily with staff and warriors she had come to know over the past month, sampling the delicious harvest food, even allowing Bram to talk her into attempting a lively traditional dance that left her breathless with laughter, despite stepping on his feet no fewer than 3 times. It was during the late afternoon archery competition, a beloved tradition where warriors from across the kingdom demonstrated their skill before the assembled crowd, that things began to take a troubling turn. Lyra sat beside Cade in a place of honor near the front of the viewing area, watching with genuine interest as competitor after competitor took their turn at the targets set up across the field. When Seraphine stepped forward to take her turn, dressed in an elegant hunting outfit that somehow managed to look both practical and striking, she paused near the platform where Lyra and Cade sat, offering a bright, seemingly friendly smile. My lady, Seraphine said warmly, would you care to try your own hand at the bow, once the formal competition concludes? It might be a lovely way to further endear yourself to the crowd, showing them your willingness to embrace our traditions. The suggestion seemed innocent enough on the surface, and several nearby nobles murmured in approving agreement, clearly charmed by the idea of their new Luna participating so directly in the beloved festival tradition. Lyra glanced uncertainly at Cade, uncertain whether the offer carried any hidden intention beneath its friendly surface. I've never used a bow before in my life, Lyra admitted honestly. I'm not certain that would end well for anyone standing nearby. All the more reason to try, surely, Seraphine pressed gently, her smile never wavering. The crowd would surely appreciate seeing their Luna embrace a bit of good-natured fun, rather than remaining always so cautious and reserved. Cade's expression had grown noticeably guarded during this exchange, though he said nothing immediately, watching the interaction with careful attention. Lyra, feeling suddenly self-conscious under the weight of so many curious eyes, now turned expectantly toward her, found herself nodding despite her own better judgment. "All right," she said, "I'll try." She could feel Cade's concern radiating beside her, even as she rose from her seat and made her way down to the archery field, accepting a bow and a single arrow from one of the attending warriors. The bow felt strange and heavy in her unfamiliar hands, and as she nocked the arrow with clumsy, uncertain movements, she became acutely aware of the entire crowd watching in hushed anticipation. She drew the bowstring back, her arms already trembling with the unfamiliar strain, and released the arrow with a prayer that it might at least land somewhere near the target. Instead, the arrow flew wildly off course, missing the target entirely, and startling a flock of birds from a nearby tree, sending them scattering into the sky with a great flurry of noise. A ripple of laughter passed through parts of the crowd, some of it good-natured, but Lyra caught, unmistakably, a sharper edge of mockery from certain corners, and her cheeks burned with fresh humiliation as she quickly handed the bow back to the waiting warrior. "A valiant attempt, my lady," Seraphine said smoothly, though her eyes glittered with something that looked entirely too satisfied given the circumstances. Perhaps archery simply isn't suited to everyone. Lyra forced a tight smile and made her way back toward the platform, aware of the whispers now trailing behind her through parts of the crowd. Cade rose immediately to meet her, his expression thunderous as he glanced toward Seraphine before turning his full attention back to Lyra, his hand coming to rest gently at the small of her back. "That was unnecessary," he said quietly, clearly for her ears alone. "I should have stopped it before it began." "It's fine," Lyra said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I agreed to try. It's not her fault I have no talent whatsoever with a bow." "It is entirely her fault for suggesting it in the first place, knowing full well how it would likely end," Cade said, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration. "She has done this before, Lyra, engineering small moments designed to make others look foolish, while she herself remains perfectly poised and untouchable. I should have recognized the pattern sooner." Lyra glanced back toward where Seraphine now stood chatting pleasantly with a cluster of admiring nobles, apparently entirely unbothered by the scene she had just orchestrated, and felt a cold, uncomfortable certainty settle into her chest. Cade was right. This had not been an innocent suggestion born of genuine friendliness. It had been calculated, deliberate, designed specifically to expose her weaknesses in front of the largest possible audience. "What do I do?" Lyra asked quietly. "I can't simply avoid her forever. She's clearly determined to make me look foolish at every possible opportunity." "You continue exactly as you have been," Cade said firmly. "You keep proving, through your actions, exactly who you are, and let her schemes reveal her own character to anyone paying proper attention. The people who truly matter in this kingdom have already begun to see the difference between genuine kindness and calculated cruelty." Despite his reassurance, Lyra found the rest of the festival considerably harder to enjoy, a persistent unease settling over her that no amount of music or laughter could fully dispel. That evening, as the celebration finally began winding down and guests started making their way back to their respective quarters, Gareth approached Cade and Lyra with a troubled expression that immediately caught their attention. "A word, if I may," Gareth said quietly, glancing around to ensure they would not be overheard. "I overheard something concerning this afternoon, during the height of the festival chaos." Seraphine was speaking privately, with one of the visiting hunters from a neighboring pack, discussing the upcoming winter hunting ceremony in unusually specific detail. "What kind of detail?" Cade asked, his expression sharpening immediately. "She was asking a great many questions about the route typically taken through the eastern ridge, the location of the most dangerous terrain along that path," Gareth said. "It struck me as odd, given that she has participated in that hunt every year, and should already know the route intimately." A heavy silence fell between the three of them as the implications settled in, and Lyra felt a fresh wave of unease ripple through her chest, colder and sharper than anything the archery incident had produced earlier that day. "You think she's planning something for the hunting ceremony?" Lyra said slowly. "I think," Gareth said carefully, "that we should proceed with considerable caution regarding anything involving Seraphine and that particular tradition. I have known her for many years, and desperation tends to make even the most careful people reckless." Cade's expression had gone hard and cold, the warmth from earlier in the day replaced entirely by the fierce protective intensity Lyra recognized from the moment he had first declared her his mate in front of her entire pack. "The hunting ceremony is still weeks away," he said. "We have time to watch her closely and ensure nothing happens to Lyra during that event." "I don't want to live in fear of her," Lyra said, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best efforts to sound braver than she currently felt. "But I also don't want to be foolish about a real threat." "You won't need to face it alone," Cade said firmly, pulling her gently against his side. "Whatever Seraphine is planning, we will face it together, and I promise you, I will not allow anything to happen to you. My wolf would tear apart anyone who dared to try." The fierce protectiveness in his voice should perhaps have frightened her, given the violence implied within it, but instead, Lyra found herself leaning gratefully into his warmth, comforted rather than alarmed by the depth of devotion behind his words. Whatever storm might be gathering on the horizon, she no longer faced it as the frightened, uncertain girl who had first stumbled into Cade's forest weeks ago. She had grown stronger, steadier, surrounded now by people who genuinely cared for her well-being, and though fear still lingered at the edges of her thoughts as she considered what Seraphine might be planning, that fear no longer held the same paralyzing power it once might have. As the three of them made their way back toward the fortress, the golden light of the festival's dying bonfires flickering behind them, Lyra could not shake the growing sense that the coming weeks would test everything she had built since her arrival, her confidence, her relationships, and most of all, the deep bond steadily growing between herself and the king, who had claimed her as his own, the very same day fate first brought them together in a quiet forest clearing. Somewhere beyond the fortress walls, in the deepening darkness of the surrounding forest, the eastern ridge waited silently, its dangerous terrain hidden beneath the peaceful cover of autumn leaves, entirely unaware of the storm that was steadily gathering above it. The weeks leading up to the winter hunting ceremony passed with an uneasy tension that seemed to hum quietly beneath the surface of everyday fortress life. Lyra continued her lessons with Flora, continued her early morning training sessions with Cade and Bram, continued slowly winning over skeptical members of the court through simple, consistent kindness. But always, at the back of her mind, lingered the memory of Gareth's troubling report about Seraphine's strange questions regarding the eastern ridge. Cade had assigned two of his most trusted warriors to discreetly watch Seraphine's movements without alerting her to their attention, and though nothing overtly suspicious had been reported in the weeks since the festival, Lyra found herself unable to fully relax whenever Seraphine's name came up in conversation, or whenever she caught sight of the elegant she-wolf moving gracefully through the fortress halls, always polite, always smiling, always somehow managing to make Lyra's skin prickle with quiet unease. "You've been distracted all morning," Bram observed one afternoon, during their usual training session, watching Lyra fumble through a footwork sequence she had mastered easily, just days before. "I'm sorry," Lyra said, shaking her head to clear it. "I suppose I have a lot on my mind lately." "Worried about the hunting ceremony?" Bram asked, his usually cheerful expression turning more serious than Lyra had seen from him before. "I heard whispers about increased watchfulness around Lady Seraphine." "Something about Eastern Ridge terrain? You've heard about that?" Lyra asked, surprised. "Fortress walls have more ears than most people realize," Bram said with a small, humorless smile. "For what it's worth, I don't trust her either. She's always been too polished, too careful with her words, the kind of person who smiles warmly while calculating exactly how much damage she could do to you if given the right opportunity." "That's a rather unsettling description," Lyra said, though she found herself nodding in quiet agreement. "I've watched her operate for a few years now," Bram admitted. "She has a talent for making things look accidental when they're anything but. If she truly is planning something for the hunting ceremony, I would advise extreme caution, my lady. More caution, perhaps, than even His Majesty realizes is necessary." His warning settled uncomfortably into Lyra's chest, and she found herself paying even closer attention over the following days to every interaction Seraphine had with other members of the court, searching for any hint of the plan that Gareth's earlier observation suggested might be forming. She noticed, with growing unease, that Seraphine had begun spending an unusual amount of time with a particular hunter named Nolan, a broad-shouldered warrior known throughout the fortress for his skill with tracking and his notably ambitious nature. One evening, several days before the hunting ceremony was scheduled to take place, Lyra found herself walking alone through a quiet corridor near the fortress kitchens, having gone to personally thank the cooking staff for a particularly delicious meal earlier that evening, when she overheard voices drifting from a partially open door just ahead. She recognized Seraphine's voice immediately, low and urgent, and something in its tone made Lyra pause instinctively before rounding the corner into view. "Simply needs to appear as though she wandered off the marked path," Seraphine was saying quietly. "The Eastern Ridge has claimed careless hunters before. No one would think to question an unfortunate accident, especially given how inexperienced she is with any kind of outdoor pursuit. And if the king suspects foul play," came Nolan's low, cautious response. "He will grieve, as any devoted mate would," Seraphine said, her voice carrying an edge of cold satisfaction that sent a chill straight through Lyra's entire body. "And in time, once proper mourning has passed, he will require comfort and companionship, and someone suitably prepared to finally take her rightful place beside him." Lyra's blood ran cold, her hand flying instinctively to cover her own mouth, to keep from gasping aloud at what she had just overheard. This was no longer mere gossip or petty jealousy dressed up in polite smiles. This was a genuine, deliberate plan to see her killed during the upcoming hunting ceremony, disguised carefully as a tragic accident that no one would think to question. She backed away from the door, as quietly as her trembling legs would allow, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might give her away entirely, and did not stop moving until she had put considerable distance between herself and that quiet corridor near the kitchens. Once she felt certain she was safely out of earshot, she broke into a run, racing through the fortress halls until she finally found Cade in his private study, going over reports with Gareth by candlelight. "Lyra?" Cade rose immediately at the sight of her stricken face, crossing the room in a few swift strides. "What's happened? You're shaking." Between gasping breaths, Lyra relayed everything she had overheard, every chilling word of Seraphine's calculated plan, watching as Cade's expression transformed from concern into something far darker and more dangerous, his golden eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "She intends to have you killed," Cade said, his voice deadly quiet, in a way that Lyra had never heard from him before, more frightening in its stillness than any shout could have been. "During my own kingdom's sacred hunting tradition." "We need proof beyond simply what Lyra overheard," Gareth said carefully, though his own expression carried the same grim tension gripping the room. "Accusations of this magnitude against a noblewoman, with allied connections, cannot be made lightly, however certain we may personally feel about their truth." "Then we will gather that proof," Cade said, his jaw set with fierce determination. "I want Nolan watched even more closely than before, every conversation, every movement documented carefully. And Lyra will not participate in the Eastern Ridge portion of the ceremony under any circumstances, regardless of what excuse we must offer the wider court to explain her absence." "She'll grow suspicious if I simply withdraw without reason," Lyra pointed out, her voice steadier now that the immediate shock had begun to settle into something closer to determined resolve. "If we want to catch her in the act, perhaps it would be wiser to let her believe her plan is proceeding exactly as intended, while we prepare properly to intervene before any real harm can come to me." Cade's expression darkened further at the suggestion, clearly torn between the tactical wisdom of her proposal and every protective instinct screaming at him to keep her as far from danger as possible. "I do not like the idea of using you as bait, Lyra, regardless of how carefully we might plan to protect you." "I don't like it either," Lyra admitted honestly. "But if we simply pull me from the ceremony without proof, Seraphine will only try again another time, perhaps in a manner we cannot anticipate or prevent so easily. If we can catch her in the act, with proof undeniable enough to satisfy even the most skeptical council member, then this threat ends permanently, rather than lingering indefinitely over both our heads." Gareth nodded slowly, clearly seeing the wisdom in her reasoning even as concern remained etched deeply into his features. "She makes a fair point, Cade. A threat left unresolved will only continue to grow more dangerous with time." Cade was silent for a long, tense moment, his gaze fixed intently on Lyra's face, searching for any trace of fear or hesitation that might convince him to override her wishes entirely and forbid her participation, regardless of the tactical cost. But Lyra met his gaze steadily, her chin lifted with a quiet, determined courage that seemed to finally settle something within him. "If we do this," Cade said finally, his voice low and absolute, You will not leave my side for a single moment during that entire ceremony. I will personally accompany you along every portion of the Eastern Ridge route, and I will have additional warriors positioned along the path, hidden but ready to act the instant any threat presents itself. Do you understand me, Lyra? I will not lose you to this woman's jealous ambition. I understand, Lyra said softly, reaching up to gently cup his tense jaw in her palm. And I trust you completely to keep me safe. But we need to do this properly, Cade. We need to end this threat once and for all, not simply delay it to some unknown future date. Cade closed his eyes briefly, clearly warring with himself before finally, reluctantly nodding his agreement. Very well, he said. But know that if anything goes even slightly wrong, if I sense even the smallest hint of real danger before our warriors can properly intervene, I will not hesitate to abandon whatever plan we have carefully constructed, in favor of simply getting you to safety immediately. I would expect nothing less, Lyra said, managing a small, shaky smile, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. Over the following days, careful preparations were made in absolute secrecy, warriors positioned strategically, along the Eastern Ridge route, under the guise of routine ceremony security, Gareth continuing his careful surveillance of both Seraphine and Nolan's movements and conversations. Lyra threw herself into these preparations with a focus that surprised even herself, channeling her fear into productive planning, rather than allowing it to paralyze her entirely. On the evening before the hunting ceremony was scheduled to begin, Lyra sat alone with Cade in the quiet privacy of their shared chambers, both of them acutely aware that tomorrow would test everything they had built together over the past several weeks, their growing bond, their careful trust, and now, quite literally, Lyra's very life. Are you frightened? Cade asked quietly, pulling her gently into his arms as they sat together near the fireplace, the warm glow casting soft shadows across the room. Terrified, Lyra admitted honestly, resting her head against his chest, comforted by the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. But I trust you, Cade. I trust that you and your warriors will keep me safe tomorrow, whatever Seraphine has planned. I will not let anything happen to you, Cade said fiercely, his arms tightening protectively around her. I have already lost too many years believing my wolf would never find its true mate. I refuse to lose you now, after finally understanding exactly what that bond truly feels like. Lyra tilted her head up to meet his gaze, and something passed between them in that quiet, fire-lit moment, a depth of connection that went beyond simple words, beyond even the strange electric warmth that had first drawn them together in that forest clearing weeks ago. Whatever tomorrow held, whatever danger Seraphine's jealous ambition had planned for the Eastern Ridge, Lyra understood, with absolute certainty, that she would face it, not as the frightened, uncertain girl who had first crossed that forbidden border, but as a woman who had grown steadily stronger with each passing day, surrounded by people who genuinely, fiercely cared for her safety and well-being. Tomorrow, one way or another, this dangerous game of hidden ambition and calculated cruelty would finally come to an end. The morning of the hunting ceremony dawned crisp and clear, frost clinging to the grass across the fortress grounds, as dozens of warriors and nobles gathered near the eastern gate, preparing for the traditional journey along the ridge that marked the formal opening of the kingdom's winter hunting season. Lyra stood beside Cade, dressed in sturdy hunting clothes that Flora had carefully prepared for her heart hammering steadily beneath a carefully composed exterior, as she scanned the gathering crowd for any sign of Seraphine. She spotted her near the front of the group, dressed once again in that same elegant hunting outfit from the archery competition, chatting pleasantly with several nearby nobles as though she carried no dark intentions whatsoever beneath her polished, friendly exterior. When Seraphine's gaze finally landed on Lyra and Cade, her smile widened just slightly, a flicker of something cold and satisfied crossing her sharp features, before smoothing back into practiced pleasantness. "Good morning," Seraphine called out warmly. "I do hope you're prepared for the Eastern Ridge portion of our journey, my lady. The terrain can be rather challenging for those unaccustomed to it." "I've been assured I'll be in capable hands," Lyra replied evenly, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the cold dread pooling in her stomach. The ceremony began with traditional blessings spoken by the fortress elders, followed by the formal procession setting out along the winding forest path that would eventually lead toward the Eastern Ridge. Cade remained close beside Lyra the entire time, his presence a steady, reassuring warmth against the mounting tension coiling tighter in her chest, with every step that brought them closer to the dangerous terrain Seraphine had specifically inquired about weeks before. As the group began the more difficult climb along the ridge itself, the path narrowing considerably as it wound alongside a steep drop overlooking a rocky ravine below, Lyra noticed Nolan positioning himself gradually closer to their portion of the group, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes flicking repeatedly toward her, with an assessing quality that made her skin crawl. "Stay close," Cade murmured quietly, his hand finding hers as the path narrowed further, forcing the procession to spread out into a thinner, more vulnerable line along the ridge's edge. It happened swiftly, exactly as Gareth's careful surveillance had warned them it might. As the group navigated a particularly treacherous section of the path, Nolan maneuvered himself directly behind Lyra, and in one sudden, deliberate movement, shoved hard against her shoulder, sending her stumbling dangerously close to the unstable edge of the ridge. Lyra's cry of alarm was cut short, as her foot slipped against loose gravel, her arms windmilling desperately, as she fought to regain her balance against the pull of gravity, threatening to send her tumbling down into the rocky ravine below. For one terrifying heartbeat, she felt certain she would fall. Then Cade's hand closed around her wrist with bruising force, hauling her back from the edge with a strength that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself, pulling her hard against his chest, just as a furious, animal growl tore from somewhere deep in his throat, more terrifying than anything Lyra had ever heard from him before. "You dare," Cade snarled, his golden eyes blazing with a fury so intense it seemed to physically radiate from him. "Attempt to harm my mate." The entire procession froze in stunned silence as Cade's warriors, previously positioned discreetly along the ridge route, suddenly emerged from their hidden positions, quickly surrounding both Nolan and Seraphine, before either could attempt to flee or explain away what had just occurred. Nolan's face had gone pale with panic, his earlier calculated confidence completely shattered. "It was an accident," Seraphine said quickly, her voice pitched with practiced innocence, though Lyra could see genuine fear beginning to crack through her composed exterior. "Nolan simply lost his footing on the uneven terrain, and unfortunately stumbled into the lady. These things happen on treacherous paths such as this." "Do not insult my intelligence further," Cade said, his voice deadly quiet, more frightening in its stillness than any shout could have possibly been. "Gareth has spent weeks documenting your private conversations, Seraphine. We know exactly what you planned for this ceremony, down to the very last detail." Gareth stepped forward at that moment, producing several folded papers from within his coat, detailed accounts of the conversations he had personally witnessed between Seraphine and Nolan over the preceding weeks. The assembled nobles began murmuring in shocked disbelief as the true nature of the plot became clear, several faces turning toward Seraphine, with expressions of growing horror and betrayal. "You planned to have her killed," one of the older nobles said, aghast, "simply to clear your own path toward becoming Luna?" Seraphine's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely, her face twisting with raw, ugly desperation, as she realized the full scope of the evidence gathered against her. "I have waited years," she hissed, all pretense of innocence abandoned. "Years of loyal service to this court, years of hoping Cade would finally see reason and choose someone properly suited to rule beside him, and then this Omega simply stumbles into his forest one morning and steals everything I have worked so hard to earn." "The bond is not something that can be earned through years of scheming, Seraphine," Cade said coldly, still holding Lyra protectively against his side. "My wolf chose her the moment it caught her scent, and no amount of ambition or plotting on your part will ever change that fundamental truth." Nolan, seeing the situation rapidly deteriorating beyond any hope of recovery, attempted to bolt toward the surrounding trees, but Cade's warriors moved swiftly, restraining him before he could take more than a few desperate steps. Seraphine made no such attempt at escape, seeming to understand that her fate had already been sealed the moment Gareth produced his carefully documented evidence. "What happens now?" Seraphine asked quietly, some of her earlier fire dimming into resignation. "You will be brought before the full council to answer for your actions," Cade said. "Attempted harm against a Luna, even one still under probationary recognition, carries severe consequences under our kingdom's laws." I expect you understand exactly what those consequences typically entail. As Cade's warriors led both Nolan and Seraphine away under heavy guard, the remaining procession stood in stunned, murmuring silence, the shock of what had nearly transpired settling slowly over the gathered crowd. Lyra found herself trembling, now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis beginning to fade, leaving raw, shaking fear in its wake. "You're safe now," Cade murmured, turning to face her fully, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, as he searched her expression with fierce, lingering worry. "I have you. You're safe." "I thought I was going to fall," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking, as the full weight of how close she had come to genuine tragedy finally settled over her. "I really thought, for just a moment, that I was going to fall." "I would never have let that happen," Cade said, his voice rough with barely restrained emotion. "I have never in my life moved as fast as I did in that moment, Lyra. The thought of losing you, of coming even a single second too late, it was unbearable. I cannot properly describe what that fear felt like." Something in his raw, honest vulnerability broke through the last of Lyra's careful composure, and she found herself crying freely now. Months of accumulated fear, and uncertainty, and hard-won confidence all crashing together at once. Cade pulled her fully into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as she wept, his own hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror that had nearly cost him everything. "I love you," Cade said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise even himself with their raw, unguarded honesty. "I have known it for weeks now, watching you grow stronger and braver every single day, watching you win over an entire skeptical court through nothing but genuine kindness and quiet determination. I should have said it sooner, but nearly losing you today made me realize I cannot wait a single moment longer to make certain you understand exactly how deeply I feel for you." Lyra pulled back slightly to look up into his face, her tears still falling freely, but her expression now filled with a warmth that chased away the last remnants of fear still lingering in her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for weeks now as well, though I was too frightened to fully admit it, even to myself." Something fierce and tender passed across Cade's face at her words, and slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was soft at first, careful, filled with all the relief and love and lingering fear that had built between them over the past terrifying hour. But as Lyra melted into his embrace, kissing him back with equal fervor, something deeper and more primal stirred beneath the surface of the moment. Cade's wolf, still riding close beneath his skin after the fierce protective fury of moments before, recognized the moment for exactly what it was, the culmination of a bond that had been steadily strengthening since the very first day their paths crossed in that quiet forest clearing. Gently, reverently, Cade pulled back just far enough to look into Lyra's eyes, silently asking a question that needed no words to be understood. Lyra nodded, her heart full to bursting with a certainty she had never felt more strongly about anything in her entire life. "Yes," she whispered. "I want this. I want you. Completely. In every way a bond like ours is meant to be sealed." Later, once they had returned to the privacy of the fortress and the watching eyes of curious nobles and concerned warriors, Cade completed the mating bond properly, marking Lyra as his true and permanent Luna in a moment of tender, overwhelming intimacy that neither of them would ever forget for the rest of their long lives together. The warmth that had first sparked between them in that forest clearing weeks ago finally settled into something deeper and more permanent. A bond now fully sealed and unbreakable, recognized not just by their own hearts, but by the ancient magic that had brought fated mates together since the very beginning of their kind. When morning came, word had already spread throughout the entire fortress and beyond, into the wider kingdom itself, that the Alpha King had formally and completely claimed his mate, that the Omega Girl who had once been mocked for her clumsiness had proven herself, through courage and unwavering kindness, worthy of standing beside their king as his true and rightful queen. Seraphine, stripped of all rank and privilege, was formally exiled from the kingdom's borders, forbidden ever to return under threat of severe punishment, while Nolan faced similarly harsh consequences for his role in the near-tragic plot. But for Lyra, standing at the window of her chambers that quiet morning, watching golden sunlight spread slowly across the fortress grounds below, The punishment of those who had wished her harm mattered far less than the profound, settled peace now humming steadily beneath her skin, the permanent bond connecting her heart forever to the man who had chosen her, clumsy feet, an uncertain heart and all, from the very first moment fate brought them together, in a quiet forest clearing, filled with pale, glowing moonflowers. Winter passed slowly into spring, and with it, the probationary period the council had once insisted upon finally came to its natural conclusion. Lyra stood once more before the full assembled council, though this time she felt none of the crushing anxiety that had gripped her during that very first formal review months earlier. She had spent the intervening months proving herself steadily, day after day, through countless small acts of genuine care toward the kingdom's people, through her tireless work establishing better support for struggling families along the border territories, through the quiet, patient way she had continued winning over even the most stubborn skeptics among the nobility. "The council recognizes," Lord Callum announced formally, his voice carrying a warmth Lyra would never have imagined possible from him during their very first meeting, "the full and permanent title of Luna, granted without reservation or condition, to Lyra Ashgrove, mate of our king, and true partner in the governance of this kingdom." A great cheer rose through the assembled hall, and Lyra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she looked out over the faces of people who had once doubted her so thoroughly, now smiling and applauding with genuine warmth and respect. Cade stood beside her, his pride evident in every line of his handsome face, and when he took her hand to formally present her before the cheering crowd, Lyra felt, for the first time since arriving at this grand, unfamiliar fortress all those months ago, that she had truly and completely found her place within it. "You did it," Cade murmured to her quietly, once the formal ceremony had concluded, and they had a rare moment of privacy amid the ongoing celebration. "Every single doubt this council once harbored, you have thoroughly and completely erased." "We did it," Lyra corrected gently. "I could not have managed any of this without your unwavering support, Cade. You believed in me from the very first moment, long before I ever learned to believe in myself." That evening, once the formal celebrations had finally wound down, and the fortress had settled into its usual quiet nighttime rhythm, Lyra found herself standing once more at the window of her chambers, though now, those chambers belonged fully to both of them, shared completely in every sense that mattered. Cade came up quietly behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin gently atop her head, as they both looked out over the moonlit fortress grounds together. "I received word from your grandmother today," Cade said. "She writes that her health continues to improve steadily, and that she very much looks forward to visiting for the spring festival next month." "That's wonderful news," Lyra said, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of seeing Agnes again, after so many months apart. "I've missed her terribly." "Perhaps," Cade said thoughtfully, "we might arrange for her to visit more permanently, if she would be willing. I know how much her well-being means to you, and this fortress has more than enough space for her to live comfortably and receive whatever care she requires." Lyra turned in his arms to look up at him properly, touched deeply by the quiet thoughtfulness behind his suggestion. "You would do that? Bring my grandmother here to live with us?" "Of course," Cade said simply, as though the answer were entirely obvious. She raised the woman who taught an entire skeptical kingdom the true meaning of genuine kindness and quiet strength. "The very least I can offer in return is ensuring her comfort for whatever years she has remaining." Overwhelmed by his generosity, Lyra rose up on her toes to press a soft, grateful kiss against his lips, and Cade responded immediately, pulling her closer against him with the same gentle warmth that had characterized every tender moment they had shared since that very first, frightening encounter in his forest so many months ago. Spring arrived with its usual burst of color and warmth across the kingdom, and true to his word, Cade personally arranged for Agnes to relocate permanently to the fortress, settling comfortably into a cozy set of rooms near the gardens, where she could tend to a small plot of flowers whenever her strength allowed. Elsie, too, visited frequently, eventually accepting Lyra's warm invitation to take up a permanent position within the fortress staff, working closely alongside Flora in managing the household affairs that Lyra had gradually taken over as part of her growing responsibilities as Luna. On a particularly beautiful morning in early spring, nearly a full year after that fateful day when a clumsy Omega had first stumbled across a forbidden border while chasing rare moonflowers, Cade suggested they take a walk together through the very same forest where their entire story had first begun. "Do you remember this place?" Cade asked, as they walked hand in hand along a familiar wooded path, sunlight filtering gently through the newly budding leaves overhead. "How could I ever forget it?" Lyra said, smiling as they approached a small clearing bathed in warm golden light, the very same spot where she had once tumbled to the ground, scattering pale moonflowers across the forest floor, while a massive gray wolf watched her with startled, curious eyes. The moonflowers had returned again this season, their delicate white petals glowing softly, even in the bright morning sunlight, filling the clearing with the same quiet, magical beauty that had first drawn Lyra across that forbidden border all those months ago. She knelt down carefully among the flowers, running her fingers gently over their soft petals, memories of that first frightening, wonderful encounter washing warmly over her. "I was so terrified that day," she admitted, glancing up at Cade with a fond, nostalgic smile. "I truly believed I had wandered into my own doom, crossing onto the land of the fearsome Alpha King everyone whispered about with such dread. And instead," Cade said, kneeling down beside her among the flowers, "you found the one thing my wolf had spent years believing it would never discover. A clumsy, hopeless mate who could barely walk 10 steps without tripping over something," Lyra teased, laughing softly. "A mate whose kindness and quiet strength transformed an entire kingdom and healed a heart I never even realized had grown so cold and guarded over the years," Cade said, his expression turning serious and tender, as he reached up to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "You gave me something I never believed I would find, Lyra. Not just a mate, but genuine happiness, the kind I had entirely given up hoping might exist for someone like me." Tears of pure joy pricked at the corners of Lyra's eyes as she leaned forward to rest her forehead gently against his. "You gave me the exact same gift," she whispered. "I came from a small pack where I was known mostly for my clumsiness, where I never once believed I might be capable of anything more than being quietly overlooked. You saw something in me that I could not even see in myself, and you gave me the chance to become someone truly worthy of the title I now carry." "You were always worthy," Cade said firmly. "From the very first moment I saw you scrambling backward through the leaves, apologizing to a wolf you believed might harm you, more concerned about spilled flowers, meant for your sick grandmother, than your own safety. That kindness was always there, Lyra. I simply had the extraordinary good fortune of being the one fate chose to discover it." They stayed in that quiet, sunlit clearing for a long while, surrounded by the soft glow of moonflowers and the gentle sounds of the awakening spring forest around them, content simply to enjoy each other's presence after everything they had overcome together over the past remarkable year. The frightened, uncertain girl who had once trembled before the powerful Alpha King had grown, through courage and unwavering kindness, into a queen truly deserving of the love and respect an entire kingdom now freely offered her, clumsy feet and gentle heart included. As they finally rose to make their way back toward the fortress, hand in hand beneath the warm spring sunlight, Cade paused once more to look back at the small clearing where their entire story had begun, a soft, contented smile spreading across his once stern and guarded face. "Whatever challenges the future might bring," he said quietly, "I know now, with absolute certainty, that my wolf chose perfectly that day. There has never been, and will never be, anyone better suited to stand beside me than you, Lyra." "Then I suppose," Lyra said, smiling warmly up at him as they continued walking together toward the home they had built, "we make quite a perfect match after all, clumsy Omega and fearsome Alpha King alike." And as they disappeared together back through the sunlit forest, leaving the quiet clearing of moonflowers behind them once more, the story of the clumsy Omega, who had once stumbled into a forbidden forest chasing rare flowers, only to be claimed forever by an Alpha King's faithful wolf, settled gently into the kind of quiet, lasting happiness that only true, fated love could ever truly provide.